Hey, I'm Will LaVeist. He's Eric ClaVille. You're tuned into LaVeist and ClaVille. Tell it to you straight the way it is from a black male's perspective. Let's get right to it. Today's show, immigration. We have a new president, but we still have a crisis at the southern border. Biden administration is now faced with the same issue that the Trump administration was really reeling over, and that's trying to stem the tide of migrants crossing from the southern border. And many of them are unaccompanied children. So Trump, when he was in position, he fortified and added some border walls. You remember his big campaign push was build the wall, build that wall. And he also had this zero tolerance policy that led to a lot of the children and families being separated. Biden has now come in and he's been focusing on executive actions to roll back much of what Trump did because of the devastation that it's just caused and the uproar it's caused, for these families. And the House, the Democratic controlled House, recently passed two smaller bills focused on immigration policy, mainly dealing towards the Dreamers, allowing some of the children who came in undocumented and were as children and have known no other place but the United States to somehow be able to get legal status and also provide legal status for farm workers and their families. So just recently, Vice President Kamala Harris has now become the point person. President Biden has made her the point person to address this problem of the crisis. And according to the administration, her two focuses are going to be on the flow of irregular migrants and addressing the root causes, she said, to prompt them to leave that's prompting them to leave their homes and home countries in the first place. And then also looking to strengthen relationships with Mexico and what is called the Northern Triangle countries, which are primarily El Salvador, Honduras, and Guatemala, where a lot of the migrants are coming from. So, ClaVille, when we look at what these root causes, obviously we got a crisis. A lot of times we try to just address the symptoms rather than getting to the root causes. And the root causes that have been cited is violence is a problem, particularly gang violence in Guatemala, Honduras, and El Salvador. Corruption in the governments has been endemic. And then failing economies, which essentially when your economies fail is usually because of corruption and mismanagement. Absolutely. It leads to the violence because people, are desperate and find illegal means to take care of their homes. So what's your take when you look at the current crisis and how you see what's really causing this?
Yeah, so Will, I'm glad you really took time to break down what the crisis is and what we're looking at. Because one thing we suffered with over the last several years in the prior administration was misinformation.
Right.
So it's very good to get the true facts and about the issues that we're facing.
Absolutely.
Now, with that being the case, let's take a look at the issues that you mentioned first, and then I want to discuss why we're in this situation in the first place. So let's take a look at it. Number one, economic instability. Now, we know that we've been in COVID-19, and if you're not looking outside of the United States, Will, the United States is the country that's really doing the best right now economically and really propping up the rest of the world.
Right. We got the largest economy, right.
The largest economy. We got the reserve currency of the world, the U.S. dollar, and other economies are flailing. I mean, they're fledgling. They are failing and they're hurting their people. Again, we're blessed to be in a country where we have these opportunities and the country can sustain currently the debt that we have to help. But of course, we got to address that later. So if you don't have any money, if you don't have an opportunity for a job, then what are these people going to do? They're going to risk their lives for the opportunity to make a living for their family.
And that's what I think is a big thing that a lot of people don't understand, or where the empathy kind of falls off, is that, think about it. If we were in this country, we move from state to state oftentimes.
Exactly.
Why?
That's a great example.
Because in one state, you don't have the economic opportunities, or you get recruited to another state because of a better job opportunity. So in the United States, which is essentially 50, countries that decided to stay together with over a federal government,
And
we
the
moved
District
from
of Columbia.
right, and this as another show, and the district and the taxation without representation District of Columbia, right?
Absolutely.
But that is, what we find. What happens is, look, if you can't feed your family, if you want better opportunities, you're going to move. And this is the migration crisis that is existing all over the world. Even when you go to other areas of the world, it's oftentimes fueled by economic desperation. And
Right.
I've got to somehow find a way to take care of my family. So a lot of people are coming here across the southern border and they're sending money back. And they not necessarily want to come here to stay here because they hate their countries and prefer to be here. They really would prefer to be there. But you're right, economics is a big key, I guess. And then the next issue would be what the corruption and
Yeah, absolutely. Corruption. So, but let me just make one more comment about economics. That was a phenomenal analysis you gave, an example of moving from state to state. Every state is different. Can you take a look at these countries? We're very similarly set up, very geographically, like South America, right? With how close we are,
yeah,
how continuous some of these borders are with each other to separate the countries and the cultures. But here in the United States, our states have different cultures. Texas culture cannot be any more different than California.
which is or different than New York, correct? Different than New York, and Mississippi culture is definitely going to be different than Illinois, so or DC. The taxation without representation. DC,
Absolutely,
right.
So need say no more, right? So when the jobs dry up in one state, you move to the next. Same thing with these countries. When jobs dry up, you move to the next. Now we talk about violence. What happens in poverty? And we always take this issue and we blame the victim, especially in our Black and poor communities, where there is lack of economic opportunity, right? And upper mobility. Then what happens is the people in the community feed on themselves.
Exactly.
And do it through violence, right? So what happens is this economic instability drives violence. And then what happens when legitimate companies, legitimate economic opportunities are not there? What happens, Will? What comes in?
Illegitimate. The black market comes in because, like you said, economic instability starts to break down families, because if you can't take care of your family, that starts to break down. And like you said, the next market that you look to is the illegal market, because out of desperation, you've got to do something. And when you get into that arena, all the rules start to go out the window. If there was any morality anyway, even in the legal system, when you go to the illegal system, the rules of engagement just start to go out the window, and profit over people gets magnified, and that's what we see.
And then we also see drug trafficking also comes in, and we know that drug trafficking also causes violence, and we know there is a problem with illegal drugs and the drug trade south of the border. We see theatrical depictions of this on television, in movies, sometimes glorifying the violence. We know that a lot of our U.S. drug enforcement policy is based upon drugs coming from south of the border, whether they become South America, Central America, Mexico, wherever it is. But we know that a lot of our policy is based on containing that and combating that. Now, we could talk about that in another show, whether it's working or not. But we know that that's the case. So when you have this type of violence, when you have hundreds of people getting killed every single month in your community, you don't want to stay there. No economic opportunities.
And not to mention, you talk about drug trafficking, not to mention human trafficking, because now there is not only human trafficking for for the sex industry. But there's also a profiteering off of the desperation of people trying to get to the United States to get better opportunities.
Right.
So you have the coyotes and all of that, people who are charging folks exorbitant fees. A lot of this is all tied into the cartels and the gang culture. Exorbitant fees getting people here, and then people, once they get across the border, become beholden on them, threats on their families, and all those things. So you just got people capitalizing on this high level of desperation that, like you said, there's a lot of it is caused by unstable governments, which leads to unstable, economies. And then you just got the breakdown of the human condition and people just suffering.
Yeah. I mean, if you take a look at the discriminatory policy that we have in the United States with Haitian Americans and Haitians and Cubans, because the Cubans don't become Americans until they get here. That comes.
Oh, yeah.
But yeah, wet foot, dry foot policy, right? So if you're coming from Cuba and you're trying to leave the island and you actually make it, then you automatically become a part of this country. You get safe passage. If you're Haitian, you're on these boats, 90 on a boat, you're in the ocean. Sometimes a lot of people die and drown, and others, they're rescued, but then they're sent right back. And even if you make it, you're sent right back. So we see that these policies are discriminatory in its nature for Black countries and a lot of poor countries. And we see this over and over again. But another thing that you mentioned earlier is that we talked about the bad economies. We talked about the violence. Now the corruption. So now you got governments that receive aid from wealthy countries to assist. But that money gets the corruption, causes the money not to get to the people to actually help the people that really need it. And that's where you have instability of government. And unfortunately, when you have instability of government, people lose faith in the government. People lose the confidence in their country. And what they end up doing is either leaving or joining the corruption itself and not relying upon the government to help them, because they say, hey, if they cannot keep their house in order, how can they help us?
Yeah, that's a good point. I mean, about, corruption and government aid, because one of the news articles doing some research said it in June 2019, the State Department announced that the administration would move forward with the more than 400 million in projects and grants that had already been approved.
Wow.
And another 180 million would be put on hold unless the governments in those three countries, Guatemala, San Salvador, and Honduras, began curbing migration to the U.S. And 370 million would be rerouted to other foreign countries. So this is one of the things.
Well, that's
Trump administration.
That's over $500 million.
Yeah, I mean, these are major dollar amounts. 750 million back in 2016 was the government spent on trying to curb this problem. So we're talking about major money. And then, like you said, where are these dollars actually going? Once it gets into the systems of these governments. So you have governments that are not really taking care of people who are clearly, desperate for a better life. I mean, you see your child starving, you've got to find some way to provide for your children. So you move, you migrate, you try to send money back. And along the way, people are getting exploited at every point of the process. And that's why now, I mean, what we really need is a comprehensive approach that gets at the root causes, that can stem this flow so that people can do what they really want, which is to stay in their home countries and have life and pursue happiness and enjoy their families, in the places of their birth.
Absolutely. And again, one thing that we enjoy here in the United States and other Western nations is political stability. And we know in order to have a successful country, you need political stability in order for investors to come that feel comfortable investing in your country. So political stability is something that we cannot take lightly, even with all of the issues that we've had in the last several years under the former president. I mean, we can't just put that in our rearview mirror. We have to realize that we could have lost it, and we could have lost that opportunity to be the example and the political stability, which therefore begets the investment. So even though it's COVID-19, even though the pandemic has ravaged our world, even our economy is still flourishing. And that's because of the stability and the checks and balances that we have that these other countries simply do not. But lastly, there is another phenomenon that's driving this wave of massive immigration
What's that?
that we haven't had in past years, and that's climate change. Some call it extreme weather events, but we know it's because of climate change. And Will, I started to study this phenomenon about half a decade ago or more. And it was predicted that weather patterns are going to change so drastically. It's not going to give our lands an opportunity to change to it properly and efficiently to allow the land.
Make the natural adjustment. So you mean climate change is not a hoax? Really?
I think we're past that, right? I mean, if you take a look at the blocks of ice breaking off Antarctica, the size of states, to me, that within itself, I don't know if you had a chance to see the time lapse of an iceberg break off in Antarctica. That is a loud sound.
Hey, I became a believer when I saw The Inconvenient Truth. Al Gore several years ago. But you still got a lot of people out there that think that that's that was all photoshopped, or that's all done in somebody's production back in the production studio.
Hey, look, let them believe it, but let them go to the the Pentagon report. I think 4 years ago, maybe 5, where it was before Donald Trump's presidency. They showed that the number one threat to the U.S. military abroad and domestically, not nuclear weapons, not North Korea, not China at that time, not Iran, not Russia, but
not Al Qaeda, not Al Qaeda.
Oh man, look, they're not worried about Al Qaeda. Look, it was rising sea levels across the world. That was the number one threat to our bases across the world. So now, if you on military bases, every single new road that's constructed, a bridge, is actually constructed about 13 inches higher. Or actually, no, I take that back. 30. It's constructed between 1 and 3 feet higher because of the anticipated increase in sea level change. So sea level change is going to happen. Water is going to increase. The tide's going to be much higher when it comes in than it was in the past. So we just have to get ready as a country and know that this is going to happen and protect ourselves and adjust accordingly. But we can do it here, right? Right now, we're working on a multi-trillion-dollar infrastructure bill. That is generational, life-changing money. I want you to know that. I want our listeners to understand that the work that's about to be put in for our country's infrastructure, for our grid, our electrical grid, our renewable energy, water systems, bridges, roads, this is generational changing for us, income-wise, wealth-wise, opportunity-wise, and
we see the impact of it just recently. I mean, in Texas, where you had this major storm came through in Texas, because Texas is on its own grid, doing what Texas does. Texas is bigger than everybody else, and you had this massive failure when the unpredictable weather change came through and shut down the grid. But when you tie this into immigration, so what you're getting at is, again, you mentioned earlier about how a lot of the economies in South America are still very much agrarian or farm-oriented economy. So if the farmers, because of climate change, are not able to grow certain crops, or the land is not producing the way that it was, now they become desperate in their families, or they have to start making decisions about certain types of crops to keep growing, which can damage the soil. And so now you also start to see how the cartels become, it can impact that, because, hey, if you can force at gunpoint a farmer to grow a certain type of crop, poppies, and cocaine and so forth, that in opium, now, again, that's feeding that black market. And this is how climate change ties into that as well. If the farmers can't do with their land what they particularly been able to do and can't provide for their families. It just feeds
Absolutely.
desperation.
Absolutely. And we see that easily in South America. We see it in Afghanistan with the opium trade, where, again, there are certain crops. I mean, you're going to plant the crop that's going to give you the highest yield.
Right.
So these drug crops are giving individuals who are in subsistence economies the highest yield. So again, Will, this is a question of, do we blame the victim, or is this a failure of the system as a whole? Because we just talked about how when your back is against the wall and there's not a lot of opportunity there for you, then what do you engage in?
Yeah, how can you blame somebody? How can you blame a father for trying to take care of his children, or a mother, for taking her children away from the gang violence and being willing to, go across the desert, being willing to go across, treacherous waters, and rivers for that. I mean, and when you think about it, the people who have that kind of tenacity and have that kind of will to make it and actually make it here, in a lot of ways, you're looking at some of the people who are the mentally strongest and in many ways the most dedicated and most determined to really make a positive life for themselves. So this is why oftentimes immigration has been said how it actually fuels and benefits a country. I mean, my goodness, we already know that America is a nation of immigrants. I mean, my mother is an immigrant from the Dominican Republic. My father was born here. But we all know
immigrants.
Right. So outside of the indigenous people here, and many of the reasons why people came here were the same reasons: failing economies, better over in Europe or wherever they came from.
That's exactly what it was. Yeah.
With the exception of our ancestors who came, in the hulls, of ships. It was failing economies that drove the Europeans here, and it was the economy and white supremacy that justified the slave trade.
Yeah.
So we're looking at very much the same dynamic. So like you said, we can get down to the root causes. We can stem the flow. One of the things I'm wondering about your take on Kamala Harris being a point person on this, and whether this may or may not be good for her career, depending on how it turns out. We know that she is the daughter of immigrants, both from Asia and also from fathers from Jamaica, mothers from India. So she knows very much her DNA is very much tied to this issue in a very personal way, as most Americans are. What do you think? I mean, is she getting set up potentially to fail? Or?
Well, Will, that's a good question. But keep in mind, every presidential administration faces a crisis, multiple crises. The crisis that Obama administration faced in its first term was administering the bailout. Remember, the bailout was signed by President George Bush, and the banks got their money first and left. Then they say, here, Obama, it's up to you now to manage and get us out of this hole.
The bailout didn't bail out African Americans, but go ahead.
Exactly. It did not bail out African Americans. No, it did not. Now it's up to you to bring the economy back for Main Street. Wall Street, we're good. Wall Street, keep in mind, Wall Street and the Connected always get their money first. Period.
Right.
All right. So we know that banks, they get theirs first and they're out. Then it's up to the common man to scrounge. So what happened was that President Obama put Vice President then, Joe Biden, over getting the economy back going by managing the bailout dollars more specifically in his part of the country where he's from, Pennsylvania, Scranton area, the Rust Belt, and getting the car companies back. And that was a phenomenal job that he did. Now, keep in mind, this thing could have went left.
South.
Right?
It could have went. Yeah, it could have went. South.
So a lot of it was his management, but a lot of it was also just the resilience of the economy, right? Building back, because it was, Maxine Waters talked about it. She said this thing was touch and go. We have no idea how close we were to the collapse of the U.S. economy because of the risk that Wall Street took and the high gains. Now, as a note, and we'll talk about this in another segment, but we're there again. We're seeing inflated stock prices. Now, for those of us that have investments, we're doing great, but we're seeing inflated stock prices that's really not supported by the fundamentals of what an economy should be supported by. So that's another issue for another day. But as you relate,
so when you look at Kamala, so are you saying that this is a good move on Biden's behalf and a good move for
absolutely.
her if it turns out as well, or is that what you're trying to say?
Absolutely. What's going to happen, Will, is that she's in a good position to show leadership with this, and again with her background. You mentioned her being a daughter of immigrants, so it adds a lot of background, to it and to her
legitimacy, cachet, yeah.
Absolutely, just like with Joe Biden being from manufacturing, Scranton, Pennsylvania. So now what happens, keep in mind, one of the plans that you mentioned is for us to stem this tide by negotiating with South American countries. We're going to give them X amount of millions of dollars. They're going to build temporary housing, clinics to house people. And also we're going to give probably, now I'm not saying we're going to do this, but it'll be wise to give some cash payments for people to go back to their countries to sustain themselves for a while, right? But really it's about building long-term relationships with these countries and reinstituting some types, as you mentioned before, the numbers, some type of accountability to get job programs for people to work. Building programs work, especially in countries like that where you have low-skilled workers, because those low-skilled general laborers and some high-skilled, they come here to work on construction areas, construction projects. So you just duplicate it there. So that's what's going to really happen. And we're going to see this. Right now, we're taking a hit. And the reason why we're taking a hit is because of the policies that former President Trump implemented. President Trump himself basically banned nationals from certain countries, reduced refugee admissions to its lowest level since 1980, reversed the decline in arrests of unauthorized immigrants in the U.S. He canceled DACA, Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals program, deported 690,000 unauthorized immigrants brought to the U.S. as children. So that means, Will, if you were brought here as a 6-month-old or 1-year-old, and you grew up, went to high school, went to college, still, you get deported back to a country you know nothing.
It's crazy.
And he also ended the temporary protection status for Haitians, Nicaraguans, Sudanese, and then signaled that Hondurans and also Salvadorians could have also lost their authorization and protection. And this was in 2017. So he created a lot of this. He created this logjam. Because look, if you deport 690,000 people, almost 1 million, what do you think those people are going to do? They're going to come back to the home that they know. So that's why so a lot of those policies that were implemented head on without a plan in order to fix the system by the Trump administration, that helped to cause this logjam. So I think we're in a good position for her to succeed in this effort. And I think it's going to be a good look for her when she eventually runs for president.
I'm going to read this quote from Jay Johnson, who is the U.S. Secretary of Homeland Security during the Obama administration, 2013 to 2017, looking at the spike in immigration that began under his watch. So he said, as far as how to solve this, he said, it has to be at least a 10-year project. There's no quick fix to poverty, violence, and corruption. We started this in 2016 with $750 million, really a drop in a bucket. Wow, he said that's a drop in a bucket. But the money was $750 million.
Wow.
He said that was a drop in a bucket, helping coffee growers deliver coffee to the market, for example. It was beginning to have an effect, but the administration has turned that money off now, meaning the Trump administration, the exactly wrong thing to do. So the moral of the story is there's no amount of security you can throw on the southern border to end illegal migration. You have to address the push factors, period. So when you hear that, what should Black people do? What should our people do in understanding this immigration issue? And again, how do we address the push factors, the root causes that are triggering this in the first place?
Well, Will, we have to be at the forefront again. As I mentioned, we have to understand the truth through facts and policy, just like we discussed. We went through the issues that the issues we're dealing with now, not made up issues, but real issues and the causation of them. We also looked at the history behind that in the former administration of policy that helped to create this. And also let's talk about understanding past policies of NAFTA and both its advantages and disadvantages, which of course NAFTA, which is the North American Free Trade Agreement, was replaced by the United States Mexico-Canada agreement in July of 2020. So we have to look at all of this and understand it in order to really get a grasp of the solutions moving forward, because we don't want to keep repeating this. Keep in mind, we're citizens of the world. We're citizens of the Americas, Canada, United States, and South America, and Central America, and South America. So we're part of the Americas, some of the richest natural resources and richest cultures in the world. So if we understand those issues, understand the disadvantages of creating bad policy, and learn from bad policy and create better policies, then I think we'll create a stronger America, which includes all our Afro Latina brothers and sisters, and all of our brothers and sisters here in the United States and across the Americas.
All right. Well, it's a wrap. Take us on home.
Well, again, thank you for joining us for this segment and this conversation about immigration. Join us next time as we talk about very important issues that are important to you on LaVeist and ClaVille. Catch us on our social media, Facebook, Instagram, Twitter. You guys know where it's at, on our LinkedIn tree, and we'll see you next time, because to us, that's the way it is.